Coincidentally, today, over the last couple of days, we're hearing lots of rumblings about the FTC and the DOJ looking at monopoly and competition against the big tech companies.
So I was reading an article the other day that was actually explaining to the consumer about how your television today is tracking all kinds of data and what you're doing.
GDPR is not just for the big guys.
Right.
Right. Everybody's responsible for taking care of consumer and employees' data.
Hey everyone, it's Rob Simopoulos, and today on the Hilt, I'm excited to introduce Ginny Lee. Ginny is a specialist in privacy law, and she's got a wealth of knowledge on the topic. During her career, she's helped a number of different companies develop privacy programs, including Starbucks, Intel, and ServiceNow. Ginny and I managed to take some time today to meet in Portland, Maine, and we'll discuss privacy and how it impacts small businesses. What do you like about Portland?
I'm digging the food scene, but also music that I can go and see bands. But the fact that you're on the water and everything is just so accessible. Like there's still a working waterfront.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah, and on the concert thing, a few years back, the Tragically Hip, so I'm Canadian, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
One of the biggest bands ever in the history of Canada. If you went to go see the Tragically Hip back in the day, they'd fill like an arena of 60,000 people. Came to Portland, Maine, and there was like 300 people there. I couldn't believe it. It was like just all of us, down at, I think we were at the State. Yeah, we were at the State.
Sure.
And I'm standing there against the stage with my wife, and we're looking at each other going, this is unbelievable. I can't believe it. I guess maybe 5 years ago. Yeah, it was crazy.
I mean, I remember, in the late 70s, when I was a kid, and actually, back when this is a sad weekend because it's the last Old Port Festival, right? And I remember when the Old Port Festival was like the thing. I mean, and they blocked off the streets and used to be able to drink in public, and it was like a whole big thing. And B.B. Buell was still living here up in town, and so she could be, trancing down the street with Todd Rundgren, Elvis Costello,
Cool.
Steven Tyler, right? I mean, any of these guys. Elvis Costello was here all the time.
In Portland, Maine.
In Portland, Maine.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Love it.
And like all the punk bands, so like the Ramones, and I mean, it was
so cool. So you grew up here in Maine?
I grew up between here and West Virginia.
Okay.
And but most of my formative years were here, certainly my teenage years and college.
So tell me the story. How did you where did you live and where did you go, and tell me a little bit about your career. How did you get into privacy?
Oh God. So I was an engineer when I graduated for that. I went to the University of Maine at Orono.
Yeah.
I was an applied math major with a minor in computer science, mostly because all the math people were the computer science professors. And back then, you could either be an actuary or teach math. So neither one of those was really anything that I was interested in. I wasn't interested in it. So I did mostly, sort of software development and tech support types of things for many years. Worked in the networking space, worked on encryption products and VPNs, and startups that got bought by big guys. So one startup called Shiva, which made remote access, and some people may remember that from years ago, because it was actually the dial-in clients for Windows 95 and Mozilla.
Cool.
And I really was interested in sort of patent law back then, because I was sort of seeing, these innovations and things, and how do you protect them? So I had always wanted to go to law school. Finally got burnt out being a product manager and engineering manager, sort of shipping product and being held accountable at the end of every quarter to get something out the door.
Right.
No offense.
Yeah. Timelines, deadlines.
Yes. Get it done. Right. And decided that it was time to go to law school. And the other thing was 9/11 happened.
Mm-hmm.
And, not to be too corny about it, but, like many people, started thinking about what could I do to make a difference?
Mm-hmm.
And was I actually doing something that was meaningful in my life? So at age 40, I went to law school and went here at Maine Law to be a patent attorney. became a patent attorney, was a registered patent attorney, but at the same time was delving into privacy issues and looking at how the online behavioral advertising industry worked, and worked for a trade organization called the Network Advertising Initiative. So while I was in law school, I got involved with that. And the IEPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And just sort of went on the privacy track. The patent side was interesting, but privacy just was, sort of this burgeoning area that needed technical people as well as lawyers. So it was a nice mix of all of my skills, which I never thought I would find a career that sort of took all that eclectic background that I had.
Tech and legal and privacy all coming together so quickly today.
Yeah, and understanding consumers. So all of that tech support as well that I had done in the past, and understanding UX and UI and how do you develop a product. So privacy engineering, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about privacy engineering today too, but that whole field was something that I was very interested in too.
Interesting. Great. And so now in Portland, Maine, and enjoying that. You've worked at some other large organizations on the privacy side as well.
I have. So I've worked for Intel, and Intel is very interesting because they have so many different types of products and services. They also had a very mature privacy program, which was really great to plug into. But I also worked for Starbucks and Yahoo. Starbucks, I helped them build a privacy program from scratch. Yahoo also had a privacy program in place, and Yahoo was actually one of the first sort of major internet companies that really was focused on privacy. And then have done a brief stint at Disney, and then another company, ServiceNow, that I know a lot of your listeners probably have heard of as well. And help them sort of build their privacy program.
Awesome. And so tell us a little bit about what are you doing today? What?
So I have struck out on my own and taking all those varied experiences and my background, and I'm helping folks either build privacy programs or help them with their existing programs, and just sort of moving along the privacy needle, especially today, as we all know, we're maybe looking at federal privacy legislation, the big industry for privacy professionals.
Absolutely. Desperate need. Definitely coming.
Yes.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the privacy side. That, we know that data is everywhere. Social media, companies, advertisers, everybody's thinking a lot about privacy, how to protect the data, all those important things. You brought up when you came in, you said, hey, there's some big news from Apple. Maybe we can talk about that for a second. I think that's really interesting. That came out today.
Yeah. So Apple has, right now is their developers conference, and they announced that they've got a new feature called Sign In with Apple. And it's going to be this service that's going to be offered to their iOS users on apps. And so, and I'm reading here from an article that I found on Gizmodo, but it says, instead of handing over your email address to a developer or using a social account like Facebook or Google, you'll soon be able to sign into your apps with your Apple ID. And so the idea is that you're going to tap on this Sign In with Apple button, and it'll authenticate you using either your Face ID or Touch ID. And it creates a unique random ID that keeps developers from accessing your personal data. If the app developer asks you for your email address, the Sign In with Apple will also give you the option to generate a unique random email address that will keep your real email private. And then any email correspondence that the app decides to send you will go to this fake email address, and they get forwarded to your regular email address.
Interesting.
Isn't that fascinating? And so it's going to roll out as part of iOS 13. And, one of the things that, I've already heard some grumbling online about this, obviously by the app developers are not real happy. But there's one of the things they said is that Apple has updated their App Store review guidelines, and that this Sign In with Apple is going to be required as an option for users in apps that support third-party sign-in when it's available later this year. So what that means is, if a developer wants to offer Facebook or Google social login options, they also have to include the Apple option too.
They force them to add that as an option because they're
Exactly.
selling it in the iTunes store.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
Exactly.
Forcing them to add it. So no wonder the developers aren't happy.
Right.
You've got to
right.
go and start coding more integrations in regards to those solutions. Holy smokes.
Right. And I think, not coincidentally, today over the last couple of days, we're hearing lots of rumblings about the FTC and the DOJ looking at monopoly and competition against the big tech companies, and Apple is certainly one of those.
Right. Timely.
Right.
So so spinning a little bit from applications and Apple. So I was reading an article the other day that was actually explaining to the consumer about how your television today is tracking all kinds of data and what you're doing. So all those smart TVs, right? So what TV shows are you going to? What apps are you using? What websites are you going to? And as you turn on your smart TV, you actually have to accept terms of use. And one of them is a privacy policy where it uses the term here. I wrote it down here. It's called ACR. And basically it's automated content recognition. And so it says, unless you turn off ACR collection in the settings menu, we may share viewing data with authorized data partners, including analytics companies, media companies, and advertisers. Right on your television.
Right.
Right. And I read in the article, they were saying, just unplug the network cable from your TV or turn off the Wi-Fi and they're not going to collect it. And I was thinking to myself, yeah, but you need to get updates and patches to how are you going to get Netflix? How are you going to get the internet?
Well, exactly. And the other thing too, when you think about it, so it tells you to go into the settings. Who the hell knows how to get into the settings for their TV, right?
Right.
And what settings are you talking about? Are you talking about the settings for the actual TV or some app for the TV that, Samsung has apps for the TV, right?
Yeah. And so the magazine continued to go on about how the price of the television has now been,
Yes.
not necessarily commoditized, but,
No, but
lowered to a very low price for this data, the fact
Right.
that this data is being
before
collected.
the tariffs.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Before the tariffs.
Yeah.
Just so they can get the data and understand how the consumers are interacting, what sites they're going to. And it's changing the world pretty quickly, right?
It is. And, one of the reasons why you're now seeing the privacy policy and the terms of service and having to consent to this is there have been some cases the FTC brought against Vizio, which was a TV manufacturer, because they were providing these types of services without consumers knowing, right? So, and they just recently finalized settlement with Vizio with regard to that case. And that case was brought a few years ago, actually.
Wow. So the Vizio televisions were doing that without people accepting the terms.
And Samsung was doing the same thing, right? So and as you probably have known, that we've had these smart TVs around since, I don't know, probably 2012, 2013 or so, right? And so whether they have apps on them, as soon as they were able to connect to the internet or to your local network and such too.
That's one of the main purposes behind it is data collection.
Exactly. And then, now not only, so I think, most people are aware that Netflix uses analytics and behavioral sort of understanding of how you're watching and what you're watching to determine what content that you watch. That the TVs are doing the same thing, whether it's through your Comcast or Xfinity or Spectrum service, or whether Samsung or Vizio or any of these TV manufacturers as well are showing you apps, sort of on the bottom side that come with the TV based on your viewing habits.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Wild. And so now you go and you buy that television, you hang it up, you plug it all in, you get it all set up, and then this privacy policy pops up. What do you do with that as a consumer?
How do you scroll through it too, right? And what does it mean to accept that?
Right.
What
other option do you have?
Well, exactly. So if you don't accept that, does it mean that you can't watch TV?
More than likely, yeah.
Right.
If you're not able to access the apps and if they can't have those feature sets, I would assume that.
Yeah. And I think that, I think that that's certainly wrong, but I think many individuals have sort of accepted this, well, I'm using Netflix or I'm using Amazon. I want to see the content that's on there. I'm used to them sort of showing me featured content based on my viewing habits.
Right.
And I don't think that they're actually correlating that with what their TV and the TV manufacturer is doing as sort of a separate.
Absolutely. I think the world has changed a lot where the consumer has just accepted the fact that they have limited privacy today.
Yes.
So it's interesting. I watch my kids, they use Snapchat all the time. And it's like, I think for their age group, it's probably the number one communications tool. The Facebook, there's no way that they're going to go on Facebook.
Right.
But they basically interact with this app with their friends every minute. And the reason why is it runs a thing called streaks. So you want to run streaks with your friends. So you have to connect with them. As they explain it to me, you got to connect with them once a day, every day in order for the streak to continue. So they've got incentives set in the app to get the kids to keep connecting to it.
Wow.
But one of the ways
Stickiness.
but one of the key ways to do it is to take a picture. So I'll watch my kids, they'll be in the car driving and they'll just be taking like a quick image of themselves, just their face, where they are, just quickly, and then moving through all their, and I try to explain, I said, you guys understand that everything that you're posting there, and I know Snapchat might delete it at some point in time, but whatever the case is, but from a privacy perspective, we've got children who are interacting with apps, taking pictures everywhere they are, and the whole bit. It's a little strange.
Well, that's a really good point. And I think, when you talk about all of these listening devices that are in our homes, and whether it's our TV, and, it's funny, people say to me, I'm never going to have an Alexa, and I'm never going to have a Google device in my home. I'm not going to be talking to them. And I'll say, well, do you have cable?
Right.
Yeah. Well, do you have one of those remotes that you talk into and tell it where to go? Well, yeah.
Right.
I said, how is that any different?
Right.
Well, it's not listening to me all the time. Is it not?
Right.
Really? Do you think so?
Yeah.
And what about other people in your house that haven't consented?
Yeah.
And your neighbors come in. So you consent to that privacy policy in those terms of service for your TV, but your neighbor allows their kid to come over and watch TV with your children. Have they consented? Have you now consented for anybody else that comes into your house?
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah, they just wander in and it's on. So what do you think we do with these privacy policies? Do you expect a consumer should read each and every one of those when they
Yes, because I've written them. They should be reading them all. I mean, they are works of art.
They are.
They're literary,
You took the time to put it together. They should.
Exactly. No, I mean, I don't even read privacy. I think there's been studies done. I know there have been studies done that said, if you were to read all the privacy policies of all the devices and software that you use, it would take up every day of your life for the next 10 years or something like that, right? I mean, it's just ridiculous. But the problem is that we have laws such as GDPR in place that say you need to provide notice to users, right, about the different types of processing, and you need to be transparent. So in order to do that, there's these really lengthy policies that go into great detail, right? So they're pages and pages really to offset what the regulators want. Mm-hmm. But in the same breath, the regulators say, well, you need to make it simple and easy for people to understand.
Right.
Well, how do you do that? By putting all that information in there with regards to everything you're doing.
Yeah. Difficult.
That's really difficult.
So you just put paragraphs and paragraphs of words together.
That's right. Well, I think what you see, and some of the good, I've seen some good examples out there. They take an approach which we call sort of a layered approach, mm-hmm. right? So you have those long privacy notices that nobody reads except for the regulators, and then you have these layered, short, more sort of folksy kind of plain English notices, right? And then you're seeing more of the just-in-time notices. So even though you saw that notice on your TV and it was lengthy, there are other vendors who have done things that are maybe a little bit more simple to read, right? Mm-hmm. And explain to you and easy, right? So
yeah, I agree. So I saw an article the other day with about UX UI design in regards to the privacy policy, and how simple terms like we will use your data for this purpose, and then it had a drop down and would drop down and give you the details, so you could really focus in on the key areas that were important to you or you had interest in, and they were teaching developers on how to design around that.
Yes, and that's exactly it. And there's also been some work done on when you see labels, food labels, on doing something similar with privacy, because these Internet of Things devices, how do you provide notice to individuals, and what are they, how can they tell if it has a camera, that the camera's on, or things like that, right? Too. Yeah. So coming up with icons that are useful globally, maybe too.
Right. Yeah. So everybody understands that that specific icon is in regards to that. Makes sense. You mentioned, changes happening from a legal perspective. Let's talk for a second about like state privacy laws. I think that's a good place to begin.
Yeah.
So California right now is working on passing a law in regards to privacy.
They have. So they've passed the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018. And that goes into effect in January of 2020. So coming up in about 6 months from now. And the focus of that law is really geared towards the larger companies. So most of your small and medium-sized businesses are probably not hit the threshold on it. However, because there's a $25 million threshold as far as your business, but there is a requirement that if you hold the data of 50,000 people, California residents, that you could be you're obligated under the law.
Even if you don't have hit that revenue target.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So if you're an internet company and you've got a lot of hits and you've got a lot of customers, right? I mean, 50,000 California residents may not be a hard bar for you to hit, right? So, but I think, most, small businesses are probably not going to be affected by it. But that said, I want, I preface that by saying, everybody in California knows that this law is coming into effect, right? They're not going to look and see whether you as a business are obligated under this law or not, right? So they're going to go after any business that they feel is impinging on their privacy rights under this law and ask them for either access to their data or for it to be erased.
Right.
So it's going to be up to the business themselves to either come back and say, and make a determination, right? Are they going to work with this consumer for this request, even though they're not obligated under the law, or are they just going to tell them, tough luck, right?
It's not my responsibility.
Exactly.
Wow. And have we seen other states, of other states who are going down that path as well? I know it's really starting to work its way across the United States, right?
It is. And Massachusetts has one that's out there. Actually, probably just about every state right now is looking and thinking about a privacy law. Washington State tried to pass one, but it didn't make it out of the Senate. And mostly, I think, because the big tech companies, so Microsoft and folks, got involved, right, in trying to help them craft the law in such a way. And then I think the legislators kind of threw up their hands and they'll wait till the next session to see if they can pass it. But I think once California is actually enforced, then other states will start to watch what enforcement looks like for California, and then decide what they'll do.
The big one a lot of organizations were talking about and trying to really get aligned with is the GDPR.
Yes.
Right? General Data Protection Regulation.
Yes. So the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, is a comprehensive European law. So prior to the GDPR being in place, there was a directive, as they call it in the EU. And what the directive was, it was more of a suggestions with regards to privacy law. And then each member state of the EU could create their own privacy law based on that directive. But what the GDPR did was said, we're going to create a regulation that is a comprehensive privacy law for all of the EU. And then each member state can make some tweaks to it. But in general, the GDPR holds for all of the EU states.
And so again, it's protecting consumers' privacy.
Yes, it is. And employees as well.
Too, as well.
Yes.
Right. So it's focused on that. And so many U.S. organizations think that it doesn't affect them because they're U.S. based and they're U.S. organizations. But it could be as simple as having an employee or even one consumer inside someone you do business with, having them in your app or in your system.
Exactly.
And then next thing you know, you're GDPR under that regulation. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. And so it's always, so one of the things that's really important is to understand what data that you collect about people and where that data is coming from.
Right.
So.
And we've seen a lot of U.S. organizations realizing that this is a challenge, and they've begun making changes. What are the key things that you see them doing in order to try to meet that regulation? Is it a lot of policies and and plans and so forth that they have to go through? Or
Yeah, I think, the larger organizations who had mature privacy programs, more of them were sort of getting a better handle on the data that they had and their data flows, but putting policies in place for sure. But even more so, understanding the vendors that they're doing business with
Mhm.
and making sure that they had the right provisions in place, whether it was from a contract provision or safety or security provisions in place. And I would say that that is something that small and medium-sized businesses really should be paying attention to. Who are those third parties that you're doing business with, and how can they, how vulnerable are you based on that third party?
a third-party assessment, is that what you mean?
Yes.
They're doing business with larger entities, we're doing push down on them in regards to meeting specific requirements.
Absolutely,
Oh, it's
right?
massive. Yeah.
Right. And especially for the small and medium-sized businesses, right? Because a lot of them are doing business for these large enterprises, and they may not realize that they have obligations under GDPR or even state laws as well, too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that happening on the cybersecurity side, where they're getting third-party cybersecurity assessments sent to them. And do you meet these requirements? Do you have plans? Are you training your team? Are you doing testing? And these small businesses are getting caught off guard on the cybersecurity side. Imagine on the privacy side, similar idea. Wow, and it does come together too. So if people don't meet state privacy laws or GDPR regulations, I know with GDPR for sure, there's numerous fines that can be applied based on the impact and how many people are affected and so on, right?
There is, and it's, the fine and the enforcement is really risk-based, right? So how large was the risk that was made by the vulnerability or the breach or whatever happened, right? And then determining the size of the business as well, too.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, I mean, we've all discovered that, GDPR, a lot of the data protection authorities are really going after the big guys. But we've seen, for instance, in the UK, that they've been going after small businesses.
Interesting.
And, they've gone after some either medical practices or small banks or things like that. And really, I think to send a message that GDPR is not just for the big guys,
Right.
right? Everybody's responsible for taking care of consumer and employees' data.
Yeah, and we've seen that happening with HIPAA for sure.
Oh, yes.
Where they've definitely penalized smaller entities and even business associates who aren't doing things appropriately as well.
That's right. And I would say too, I mean, they're really going after the people that are more egregious on this. If you're somebody who's made a mistake and an honest mistake and you've tried to rectify it and you can work with the supervisory authority or the DPA, they're willing to do that, right? And the same thing here in the US. So the FTC is willing to work with businesses, and if they send you a letter or a warning or something like that, I mean, they're not looking to get you.
Right.
But if you've done something that's really egregious and you've decided to sort of thumb your nose at them,
yeah,
then obviously they're going to look at you.
In trouble. Well, what do you think a small business should do? So if they see state privacy laws coming down, GDPR, what does a small business do today? What are some of the simple steps that they should take in order to sort of do a review?
I think, very similar to what they do on the security side, right? So it's all about prevention and really understanding what data that you have and whether you need all of that data. Oftentimes I hear, especially from startups, that I can collect all this data. What are you going to do with that data? I don't know, but I just know I can have all that data.
Right.
Well, the problem is that if you have a breach and you have all that data,
right,
now you've created this huge risk for yourself.
Right. Absolutely.
Where you may not have needed all of that, right?
Yeah.
So the concept of data minimization is really important for small and medium-sized businesses, and understanding retention too. So how long do you need to have that data? So maybe you do need to have some of this more in-depth personal data, but do you need to hold it forever? Or could you just hold it for 30 days or a year or something like that? And if that's the case, then in your privacy policies, you should probably tell people that as well.
Right. And then if they're no longer a customer, what you're going to do with that data once that relationship is finished.
Exactly.
And that's what we're talking about here is it's not about not collecting data and utilizing it to run your business. It's allowing people to have control, right, over their own data and when they can turn it off and turn it on and what they can allow you to use and and not use, right?
That's so true. And then the other side too, we were just talking about vendors, understanding who are those third parties that you're doing business with,
Right.
whether it's you're providing a service to a large enterprise and what your obligations might be, or if there's somebody else who's providing a service to you along the way, along this value chain, and do you have controls over that too?
I'm starting to think a little bit about small business, and it's a lot to really think about. If you think about that, you have to identify, do a data classification. What's the data that you're storing? How do you have it protected? What's the impact of losing that? What's the privacy side of it? As a small business entity, it's a lot to go through.
It is, but in some cases, if sometimes smaller is better, right? Because a lot of times you've got not as much data coming in, not as many players in your ecosystem, and you should have a better handle on your data flows than a large enterprise does sometimes, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
you would hope so.
Yeah, you would hope so for sure. So the other part about it is actually protecting the data. So I have some very interesting conversations with small business owners who, when I say to them, what's the data that's being stored on your servers, your computers, your hard drives, trying to keep it really simple for them. It needs to be protected. They go, I don't have credit cards. It's like the first place they go, I don't have credit cards. I don't need to protect that. But when you start digging into them and you start saying, forget about privacy, you have vendor price lists, you have legal agreements, you have, then we start getting more into the employees. Think about the employee
all
information.
of that information you have, right?
Right.
Yeah, and especially let's say you have to do all those I-9s, right? And you took photocopies of people's passports and things. What did you do with that?
Right.
Where'd you put it?
Yeah, absolutely. So storing a lot of really sensitive data, just even on their own organization,
right.
Putting it in a place. So they've got to protect that properly, and then in the end, protect the privacy of their employees and their organization from top to bottom. Absolutely. So recently, I've noticed that a lot of websites, when I log in there, you've seen this floating pop-up window that's following me all over the place saying, accept this policy, and you really can't do anything on the website. Is that all driven because of the recent regulations, or what's happening there?
Well, I think it's partly GDPR, but it also was there prior to that. So there's another law or directive actually in the EU called the EPrivacy Directive. And the EPrivacy Directive is the one that caused us to start seeing all these cookie banners a few years ago.
Right.
And because people were collecting cookies and tracking people on the website. So that you can thank the EPrivacy Directive for that. Now, there's been a push to get the EPrivacy Directive to become a law, just like GDPR took the prior directive and made it a law. And the goal was to have that EPrivacy regulation roll out at the same time as GDPR. But nobody seemed to be able to agree. So it's in this sort of stasis right now. There's been a couple of drafts of it. And as you can imagine, the ad industry, all the behavioral advertising folks are very worried about too much regulation in that space because this is what drives websites. This is why you get free content.
Oh my goodness,
the
cross-platform sharing of data is unbelievable.
Exactly. And so that sort of drove these cookie banners and such. But this increase in activity, since last May certainly was driven around GDPR, but GDPR doesn't, officially state in there about websites and about cookies. It's all around processing. And so there have been some people who were concerned about, when I drop a cookie on your computer, that's considered processing. I could fall under GDPR, so I'm just going to be better safe than sorry. So I think that's the other reason why you saw this influx of activity with regards to consenting to, whether it's their privacy policy or the use of cookies on their site.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of that, when you log into a website today, let's say I think the most recent stat I read was that a small business uses over 20 software as a service applications to run their business. Wow. So think about QuickBooks, LinkedIn, you just start counting, it just starts adding up.
Wait a minute, I'm a small business of one and I use about 5. So
right.
I guess that's about right.
Right. But every one of those, when you log in there and you sign up with an account, it's a privacy policy, it's an acceptable use, terms of use, right? Yeah. Do you think you should take time to be reading any of those? I know we talked about the privacy policy. How about terms of use? I guess in the end, there's nothing you can really do about it.
There's not much you can do if you really need to use that service. So for instance, I have I use Google Gmail for my business email, right? And so I had to accept those terms to use all of those apps, the enterprise apps. I didn't have a lot of, well, I guess there's some choices out there, but it's not a lot anymore, right?
No.
So I think, small businesses are stuck.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely they are.
Unless they create their own.
Yeah, they can create their own. Speaking of that, tell me a little bit about developing apps, because I know you come from a tech background and so forth. If you're a developer, or if you have a team of developers, should you be teaching your team how to code properly from a privacy perspective?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, the GDPR actually talks about privacy by design. So the concept is privacy by design, and GDPR is is pushing that developers and businesses and enterprises really be focused on just that, right? Keeping in mind as you're developing your services and products, privacy. And, what does that mean? Is it being transparent with how you're collecting data, offering choices to individuals at the time that they're using the app, things like that. So most definitely, I think, any business should be looking at this. And by the way, I think you're going to start seeing like Apple and these other app platforms where people are posting their apps, forcing them to do it as well too. So like if there's certain settings, certainly Apple has pushed developers around location, right? And giving users the ability to make location a toggable kind of feature, right? So we're going to see more of that where platforms will start to dictate it. So it just makes sense for small businesses to be focused on it.
Interesting. And then, so when we think about privacy, and obviously I'm in the cybersecurity business, it almost feels like they cross paths, or they have to run in unison together, right? That's what we're talking about.
And in fact, privacy by design. So the privacy by design principles were actually developed by the Ottawa Privacy Commissioner. And as one of the principles is around security too. So this making sure that you're developing privacy, building privacy in, but also security in the same vein, right?
Yeah. Do you see that? So the statistics are all over the place, but they're saying that there's going to be a lack of, or a shortage of cybersecurity professionals in the next few years. How about on the privacy side? If we see enterprise organizations now making that part of their business, and where do people learn how to become privacy folks and get in the industry? Where do you go?
Yeah, so it's the same deal, right? So there's this large organization called the IEPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals. They just hit the 50,000 member mark a couple weeks ago, which is amazing.
Wow.
And these are people, this is a global organization with chapters all over the world now. Started, about 10 years ago. I mean, they only had like 1 or 2 conferences. Now they have conferences all over the world. But they've also stated that there is a real shortage. And where do people get trained? Well, there are some of the law schools. I mean, traditionally, it was lawyers who were privacy professionals. But now we're seeing, a push to have non-lawyers, obviously. Right. Thank goodness. I'm sure a lot of people feel. But beyond the policy and the legal side of it, we were just talking about privacy by design. So there's a whole discipline called privacy engineering. And so you have schools like Carnegie Mellon that have a degree program for privacy engineering. But there still aren't enough people that are either focused on it or understand it. So I think just like in security, those of us who are working in this field are trying to make a big concerted effort to try to get as many people sort of either interested in privacy, make it part of their job some way or somehow, right?
Oh, I think there needs to be an awareness. I'm not sure that people understand that there's a whole industry around privacy.
No, but I think, if we come up with a federal privacy legislation, I think that will certainly help.
It'll change quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. What else would you like to share with the listeners? Any other thoughts in regards to privacy that might be beneficial for them to learn about or think about?
I think, everybody should, even if you don't think that privacy affects your life, I think just take a moment to look around you and look at all the devices that are surrounding you, even if you're not at home.
Right. Just walking down the street, cameras watching you.
Smart cities. We didn't even get into that, but just think about it. All those things that are going on in the city to either track you or, make sure that to fight crime and things like that too.
Yeah. Everywhere you go.
Everywhere you go.
Ginny, thanks so much for coming in and chatting with us.
Great. Thanks.